Today, I'm very honored to welcome our next guest, Deputy Assistant Secretary for Intergovernmental Affairs for the U.S. Department of Veterans Affairs, John Garcia. Mr. Garcia is a Vietnam veteran who served in the Army's 4th Infantry Division. More recently, he was the New Mexico Secretary of Veterans Affairs. Please join me in welcoming Deputy Assistant Secretary Garcia.
Buenos dias. Good morning. Before I begin, I think it'd only be appropriate if I recognize all the Vietnam veterans and ask them to please stand. This is your day. You're being honored and recognized. Will you all please stand and be recognized? For all those young Vietnam veterans, I see a lot of gray-haired guys, overweight. You know, we never think we're going to get old, do we? I've got to tell you, just quickly, I had the opportunity of going to Walter Reed Hospital recently to meet with a wounded warrior from Iraq. And he wanted to meet with some Vietnam veterans. And 4 of us walked in the room, and I met this young man that was laying in his bed that had his arm in a cast, a bark, was missing his left arm, missing his left leg. And it took all my strength just to walk up to him, shake his hand, and tell him thank you for his service. So I shook his good hand and I said, I want to thank you for your service to your country in Iraq. And he looked at me and said, are you a Vietnam veteran? I go, yes, I am. He said, well, shake my hand like you mean it. This is an Iraqi young 18-year-old vet. And sitting next to him was a young lady, about 36 years old, and I said, well, your boyfriend's a pretty tough guy. And she said, oh, that's not my boyfriend, that's my son. She said, but his grandfather's a Vietnam vet. And I kind of looked at her like his grandfather. So I didn't see myself yet as that grandfather type. But it really hit me, Governor, is that the torch of freedom that we talk about has truly been passed to a new generation. And so we Vietnam veterans have passed that torch. And so I'd like to ask our Iraqi veterans in the audience, where are you? Afghanistan vets, I know you're in the audience back here. We want to thank you, guys. That you don't come home to what we came home to. So I thank you for that. So Governor Scott Walker, Lieutenant Governor Clayfish, our dear friend, Medal of Honor recipient, Gary Wetzel, my hermano George Banda, Richard Liebeck, distinguished guests, fellow Americans, but most importantly, my brothers and sisters, Vietnam veterans and veterans in the audience. And I also especially want to thank my dear friend, your Secretary of Veteran Affairs, who's a true champion for your veterans, and that's Mr. John Scopus. Would you please give him a round of applause? It's great to see you again, my friend. You know, it's once been said that soldiers don't get to choose the war. Honor accrues not to the battle fought, but services rendered. It's a question of giving back to your nation. That's where true patriotism really begins. I got to tell you, because Mr. Bachman said we all have our stories, but 44 years ago, on May 16th, 1969, an 18-year-old who had just graduated from high school stood in one hand with his high school diploma in one hand and a draft notice in his other hand. And he stood in the local county courthouse with other young men. He raised his right hand to defend the Constitution of this country against all enemies, foreign and domestic. And he joined other young men and women who heard President John Kennedy's call when he said his 1961 inaugural address, "Ask not what your country can do for you, ask what you can do for your country." And so my life's journey began that day. I am a proud Vietnam veteran who served my country. I'm a service disabled vet. And I am who I am because I'm a Vietnam veteran. I served my country with 3.4 million other young men and women that took up that challenge and performed their duties in a strange and far-off land called Vietnam. In a war that found protest and unrest at home. A war that took this country and its youth through 13 years of bitter conflict. And finally, a war that took over 58,000 lives, whose names are now etched on a long black wall in our nation's capital. At least we never forget the sacrifice that they faithfully have made. And during the 60s and during the 70s, young men went to war, and women, usually returning isolated and unwelcome individuals to start their educational, their professional, their business careers, and their personal lives several years off the pace of their peers who didn't go to war, who didn't serve during the Vietnam era. Going to war was brutal, and it was difficult, but often so was the alienation of coming home. As returning Vietnam veterans, we came home to half the country saying that we had lost the war, and the other half saying that we were fools for having gone. And with that attitude, a whole generation, the whole Vietnam experience was repressed. And for much of the 70s, we, the veterans of Vietnam, we simply vanished along with our pride and our honor. We lost our youth in Vietnam, doing what our country had asked us to do. Yes, Vietnam was a painful experience for both our country and for our families, and our nation wanted to forget it. But today, many of our fellow Vietnam veterans are now executives and they're founders of major businesses throughout our country. They become partners of law firms, bank presidents. They're successful physicians who once were the medics and surgeons that served on the battlefields of Vietnam. They're executives within our national labor unions and our interest groups. They're committed fathers, husbands, wives, mothers. You, the Vietnam veteran, you emerged as leaders in your own communities. The Vietnam battlefield produced several individuals who have filled roles as political leaders. You become congressmen, senators, governors. The Secretary of State is a Vietnam veteran today. The Secretary of Defense is a Vietnam veteran. And our Secretary of Veteran Affairs, Eric Setseki, is a Vietnam veteran, double Purple Heart recipient. All linked together by a common bond, a brotherhood. This strength has come from the public respect and emotional bonding. But there are two recurring themes are the Vietnam Veterans Wartimes Tour that work to deepen, not diminish, our sense of incapacity for public service. Another was that these men sought out a mature reconciliation across the division that fractured our generation during the Vietnam War. It's been nearly 50 years after the war, and America has begun to accord honor and recognition to the men and women who fought in Vietnam. There has developed a deep respect for maturity and wisdom, and a sense of public service for those who returned from the war. Because of their respect, many Vietnam veterans have earned and maintained a public trust. How many of you attended the dedication of the Vietnam Veteran Wall in Washington, D.C.? 250,000 Vietnam veterans attended that. Just a quick little short snippet story. You recall there wasn't a flagpole there at the wall. We Vietnam veterans sent in our own money to help build our own memorial. We held our own parade, and we dedicated our memorial back to the country. But that day, many Vietnam veterans noticed there wasn't a flagpole there. Any special forces people? I'm going to tell you what you guys did. Around D.C., many of the units had reunions going on. The special forces had a reunion they lowered it down to ground level. And Vietnam veterans immediately moved up together in parade formation. And they walked to the Vietnam Vet Wall with that borrowed flagpole. And they stood in formation for a year and a half until the country built us our flagpole. That's the dedication you all have. You have passed that on to your children. And you are a father and a grandfather, a mother and a grandmother of those men and women who are serving in Iraq and Afghanistan today. And you've taught them the duty of patriotism and what honor is. As during Vietnam, we were young. We were young men thrown together in a war in a distant land. And our shared experience has given us a language and memory and friendship that has bonded all of us together. On this it is certain, from all that has taken place, the Vietnam Veterans Wartime Tour worked to deepen, not diminish, our sense of pride and commitment to serve. Today, the Vietnam veteran has emerged as the doer, the achiever, the one who's willing to stand up for his beliefs, the one who looks at something extra to do for his country. And today, we will leave here with a greater understanding. We will never forget. We will always remember forever. We'll always honor and welcome home our fellow veterans. Because as a young man or woman today who will raise their right hand to defend the Constitution of this country, to serve on the front lines of defense of our nation, who's willing to bleed, die, and be wounded in body, mind, and spirit, we must guarantee them that when they come home, they need to be on the front lines for jobs, education, housing, employment, all the things that you have fought and they have fought to defend in our nation's capital, in our country. We must guarantee that to them when they get home. In a few days, our nation will pause to honor all men and women, past and present, who have fought as wars and stood watch around the world through a restless respite from war we call peace. It's a day of remembrance and gratitude. So today we remember the sacrifices of our veterans who have gone before us. Thank those who are still in our midst and exhort each other and our young to live up to their example of selfless service for a common good. And by our participation here today, our expressions of gratitude to those who have served and those who are still serving. And by our advocacy on behalf of all veterans, we acknowledge our continued dependence on men and women in uniform to protect and defend our nation and assure past and present generations of our nation's continued commitment to keep President Lincoln's promise to care for those who shall have borne the battle and for those who leave behind. It's our sacred duty to do so. In closing, I want to say, President Kennedy also said, which is his 50th anniversary coming, a nation reveals itself not only by the men and women it produces, but also by the men and women it honors, the men and women it remembers. So to you, my fellow Vietnam veterans, hold your head high for your family, your state, your nation, your country is remembering you today. May we always be a grateful nation, respecting the heroic sacrifices of our American men and women who answer our country's call to serve and to protect our country and our way of life. May God give their families comfort. May God always bless America, the land of the free, the home of the brave. Thank you and welcome home. God bless you.
Secretary Garcia for his kind words today. We are honored, truly, to